7, 6, 11, 5, 9 and 20 miles today, 4, 11, 17, 32 the day before. Boot, 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 boot.
Hello, this is episode number 2 for the Unregulated podcast for the MacIverInstitute. I'm Michael Lucas, a policy analyst, and I am joined by Andrea Nolan, who is a fellow Wisconsinite, a historian, and we are talking about her book, brand new book, Lincoln's Counterfeiters, the Wisconsin gang that funded the Union and started the Chicago mob. Really excited to get into this and talk about this story because there's a lot of crazy stuff going on in the world right now. Impending doom, wars, famine, disease, genocide, all sorts of things like that. And it's going to be nice to talk about a much lighter subject, which is a national crime syndicate counterfeiting greenbacks and prostitution
Oh,
and
yes.
the trafficking of freed men. So it's going to be a nice break
Oh,
from all the
yeah.
craziness. And if it gets too serious and too dismal, we just have to remember that it happened a long time ago. So, um, Andrea, first thing, so tell us a little bit about yourself, where you come from, your background, education, and most importantly, how it is that you, I don't know, discovered this topic, because as far as I know, this is like completely original work.
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
no historian myself, but it
Pretty
seems
much.
very original.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me on, Michael. And I was born in Monroe. So the location of the book, I mean, my hometown was the distribution headquarters for the game, and I guess the best way to answer those questions is to say that being born here, I moved back after college, shortly after college, and I became interested in local history. And one day, the local historical society sent out this letter about yeah, the work was by a guy called Tom Michael, and he had done a newspaper review of the court case surrounding Bo Mlada, who was the head of the gang in our area. And he talked about how the notes being counterfeited were high denomination. They were like $500 bills, $1,000 bills. And that really struck me because before I came home, I had worked in the financial industry in New York and London for a while. And, in the 1860s, counterfeiters did not counterfeit, $500 bills. They did $1 bills, $2 bills, stuff that they could use to cheat day laborers and, shop assistants and things like that. So I knew when I saw this article that these counterfeiters were looking to cheat other bankers. And that was very interesting to me. So I asked Tom if he'd mind if I looked into this a little further, and he wasn't interested in taking any further. So I did. And I put my like professional background to use doing that. And I sort of just followed the money, where were these bills being produced? Who was producing them? Who enabled that? And this whole sort of horrific story about the Lincoln administration enabling the counterfeiting of their own bills to cheat other Union banks to finance Lincoln's war when it wasn't going very well for him, and when it wasn't a very popular war up here in the North for him. And when a lot of financial institutions were suffering because their access to Southern capital had been taken away. So I was very lucky. I feel like my life was just a confluence of events that allowed me to interpret this information the right way and pull out all the different strings and be able to follow this incredible network of 19th century organized crime and how it went all the way to the top of the Lincoln administration. So that's what got me here.
Um, Something that you say in the introduction, it's also, I think, also on the back flap when you're talking about the confluence of people that are involved in this. You not only have this gang which is headed by Napoleon Bonaparte Lotta,
It's
Bone
a
Lotta,
beautiful name.
right? Um, but it's also tied to Abraham Lincoln
Yes,
directly with his
with Salmon Chase, his
with
treasurer.
right with Salmon P. Chase,
Hmm.
and also has another very famous figure who is
Hmm.
working as sort of their muscle, their protection. This famous investigator, who is this person?
Okay, Alan Pinkerton.
Yes, of
Okay, yes.
Pinkerton fame.
Alan Pinkerton. You see, Bone Lotta, they called him Bone Lotta, okay? And his main business model was distributing these just wads of high denomination bills through the railway system. And in 1857, when he just came to New York, to Monroe, we were just getting our railway down from Milwaukee. And that was plugging us into the whole railway network that Alan Pinkerton was head of security for down in Chicago. So Bone Latta was able to use Alan Pinkerton's Chicago railway network for 14 years, moving wads of high denomination bills around without Mr. Pinkerton, ever being aware of it, apparently. And that's shocking because Alan Pinkerton made his name busting counterfeiters. So that, the biggest counterfeiting ring in the United States could just happen to be using his railway network is pretty astounding, you know. And of course, then, during the war, President Lincoln gave Mr. Pinkerton all sorts of power as a military spy master um, at a time when there was a lot of cotton smuggling going on through Chicago. So as I researched this, I kind of got the impression that the Lincoln administration and his close partners were an organized crime crew, that just happened to get lucky and find a way to power in Washington. Yeah, it's frightening stuff. And this wasn't stuff they weren't criminals for the war. I mean, they were criminals long before and criminals long
Mm,
afterwards. This gang was not busted until 1871 when the Grant administration was dealing with a number of scandals and things just got too hot in Chicago for Bone Latta and his crew up here. And so the Secret Service eventually did come in. They didn't work with our local law enforcement. My assumption there is because they assumed they were corrupt, and I think that was probably a fair assumption. They swooped in one evening, picked Bone Latta up, and took him for trial in Janesville. And my point in saying this is in describing this is because Bone Latta was really the only guy who was ever prosecuted.
yeah,
We know that he had protection from our chief banker here in Monroe, because Arbut Ludlow was the banker's name, and he personally paid bail for one of Bomada's accomplices. So I mean, we know that Arbut Ludlow was involved. But Bomada was the only guy who ever did any time, the only high level guy who did ever any time, and he was eventually given a presidential pardon.
right. Who pardoned
So
him again?
I think it was Rutherford, but it was the
Okay,
last Reconstruction president. I
okay,
forget I forget which one. So he didn't even really do that much time in jail when it came down to things. And it was shocking to me what I found. Bone Latta came from a family of counterfeiters, and this wasn't unusual for that period of United States history. About a third of the bills in circulation were counterfeit. And it was family networks who would do this counterfeiting. And they tended to be originally from the East, from the Northeast. And as policing improved in the Northeast, they were sort of driven westward. And by 1857, Monroe, Wisconsin, which is kind of on the border with Illinois and Wisconsin,
right.
we were kind of like a whose jurisdiction, fuzzy, sort of just over the border place where it was really easy for this crew to organize their distribution channels. Um, the bills, this is where Lincoln's Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase comes in particular, because the bills were printed by the American Banknote Company's employees in New York. Okay. And it was Salmon Chase who sprung the lead counterfeiter from jail in 1857. Okay. This would have been when Chase was the governor of Ohio. So before
Hmm.
Lincoln appointed him, right? He's 3 years before he was appointed. Chase sprung Josh Minor from jail in Ohio, and Josh immediately went to New York and started organizing an industrial scale counterfeiting operation of northern banknotes. And by the time the war was in progress, they were counterfeiting national banknotes. So these were the special banks that Lincoln had given special mandates to still be able to print their own money during the wartime. So the fact that the Treasury Secretary's man was creating these notes using the very company that the Treasury had contracted with to make the notes, using their employees to make the fakes, and then shipping them way out here to little old Monroe, Wisconsin, and using our railway network to then distribute them through Chicago and all the way down into Mexico. I mean, this was a big
Wow.
distribution operation, but it targeted northern banks.
Yeah.
Okay, they weren't going after Southern banks. This wasn't like an economic warfare. Well, not against the South anyway. It was economic warfare against Lincoln's opponents in the North. Because if you weren't one of these national banks, you had a lot of your business taken away from you during this war, with the National Banking Act. You couldn't print your own notes anymore. And that was a huge part of banks' ways that they made money back then. There was no nationalized national currency system then.
Yeah. There
It was
were
more
a number
regional.
of competing currencies. Every bank issues
Exactly.
their own notes,
And
which
that's
would
the rub.
confound the problem with counterfeiting because now you have to be able to recognize what's authentic for a multitude of different banknotes.
Right. And the guy at the center of that reckoning was a guy called John Thompson. He published the Thompson's Banknote Reporter, and that was the industry leader for alerting bankers, businessmen, everybody about which counterfeit banknotes were in circulation and how to identify the counterfeits. And that Thompson was the man who designed the national bank system for Lincoln. Okay.
Okay. Yes.
Okay. And so it was devious, but it was brilliant too, because what they were doing with these counterfeit notes, they said, okay, look, banks, if you're gonna hold a certain amount of your reserves in my greenback currency, i.e., if you're gonna lend me money to fund my war, you're gonna keep the right to be able to print notes, print your own banknotes, and then lend those out to people and continue on money, making money that way. If you don't, if you don't do that, if you don't lend me the money I want, then we're taking away that right from you. So it was making like a built-in pool of capital for Lincoln to continue his war with. But by also creating a lot of off the books, counterfeit, high denomination banknotes, Lincoln could do all this wartime spending, but make it look like he wasn't increasing inflation as much as he was. So he was keeping his interest rates, the cost of his loans down at the same time. So he's helping his friends. He's helping his banker friends. He's getting the money he needs to finance the war. And where he's going overseas to get money, he's keeping the price for himself down by not admitting to how many American dollars he's creating. So he was winning on a lot of fronts by doing this. And he used the guy who was, Thompson was the guy who had his finger on the pulse. He really understood the American, financial system and the currency system. And that's how we got the national bank system that we have today. And of course, our man in Monroe, Aribert Ludlow, got in on early on that. He set up a national bank here. He was one of the first clients for the national bank down in Chicago. So, if you knew the right people, you could really make hay by being part of the system. And a lot of the big banks that we have that operate now, like JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, they can trace their ancestry back to banks that were formed at this time and were national banks. Okay. So, I
Yeah.
mean, the advantage this gave Northern bankers who got in bed with Lincoln was phenomenal.
Mhm.
And over this period, over the period of the war, our national debt increased by a figure 40 times. Okay. I mean, I forget the exact number it was at the end, but it was in the billions. And this is in 1860.
Yeah.
So the amount of money, the amount of credit that Lincoln had to pull out of the economy to do this was, astounding. And counterfeiting was one way that he was able to do that.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I did. First of all, I did not know that basically the money supply or the debt, was it? The debt increases
That
40 fold, something like that.
40-fold.
That
Yep.
is insane.
It was insane. It was an incredibly expensive war, incredibly destructive. And on top of just these shenanigans, for northern banks, um, in our area, okay, up in Chicago area, going into that war was extremely difficult because we
Mhm.
had no sound currency. All the banks operating in our area were corruptly run, and they didn't trust each other's notes.
Hmm.
The best actually was an illegal currency, excuse me, run by a insurance company. That's what everybody wanted to use. So what they did was they went down to Missouri because banks in Missouri were really responsibly run. And so a lot of banks up here in our area had their reserves in Missouri notes while they were printing their own notes and kind of printing too many of them, given the amount of
Hmm.
reserves they have, and nobody trusted those Chicago area notes. So when Lincoln declared this war, and Missouri was on the southern side, that was a slaveholding state.
Mhm.
So when Lincoln declared this war and suddenly they can't spend these slave state dollars and they have all the what do we do? What do we do? How do we keep our economies going? Well, Bon Latta was there to get the money to the good banks, the good banks at the right time. Yeah, and the rest is history.
So for Bone Lotta, so you said counterfeiting it people were counterfeiting forever, even prior to
Yes,
this ordeal. And
very much.
it's
Yeah.
a family ordeal. So if
Yes.
your mom and dad are counterfeiters, you and
You
your
were
siblings
born
are
into it.
counterfeiters, and you
Yeah.
can
And
marry
you
into a
married a
counterfeiting
girl.
family
Yeah, you
too.
married a girl from another
Yeah.
counterfeiting family, or maybe your cousin, because they're also counterfeiting.
Yeah.
So it was tight. And that's kind of where the Chicago connection comes in with
Mm.
Alan Pinkerton.
Okay.
Because the reason, like, Pinkerton was security chief for the railways, yes. But he wasn't the crime boss of Chicago, okay?
Mm.
The crime bosses were this clan of interlocking families, okay, called the Kentucky Colony, okay? And the reason they were called that is because they came up from Louisville en masse in 1853. Why would they do that? Okay, there was a massive counterfeiting bust in Louisville at that year. The American banknotes predecessor company had been working with an elite group of counterfeiters in Louisville to counterfeit certain Ohio banknotes that were highly respected. Okay. Well, those guys get busted. The predecessor company strategically retreats to New York, renames itself the American Banknote Company, and then starts working with Sam & Chase's newly freed lead counterfeiter to supply notes up to Monroe, Wisconsin,
Mm.
where they're then distributed to the place where this Kentucky colony just happens to relocate in Chicago.
Okay.
You see?
Yeah.
So, and back in Louisville in 1853, when that original counterfeiting ring was busted, none of the top people went to jail.
Mm.
Okay. One guy called Ransel Lamb, who was the engraver for the Edison, Rod, and Wright and Hatch, which is one of the predecessors to the American Banknote Company, he got busted. They said, oh, yeah, well, he was moonlighting for counterfeiters, bad dude, will never happen again. Well, of course, 4 years later, that's exactly what happened up in New York. Um, so there you have it, And these Kentucky colony people, we should talk more about them because they were
Yeah.
incredible. They were extremely well organized, very far-sighted, and absolutely ruthless.
Hmm. So for Bone Lotta, is he just counterfeiting to begin with, or like does he have the approval of say Lincoln or the Republicans and the protection of Pinkerton before he really starts getting into this,
Yes, he
or
did.
is he doing it and then they pick him up and say, "Hey, we like what you're doing. We're going to bring you under our wing."
Yeah, no, he did have what happened is back in the mid 1850s, Bone Latta got busted in Michigan. He and his
Mm,
dad were working in Freedom, Michigan, counterfeiting. And the local judge there let Bone Latta off because he could prove to the judge that he was a Pinkerton agent.
mm.
Okay. Then he comes down to Monroe and starts using Pinkerton's Chicago network to distribute his counterfeiting. So yeah, no, I think taken together, um, and of course the Kentucky colony supported Lincoln through the war. The Kentucky,
Right.
even though they were usually Democrats,
Hmm.
and afterwards they were the Democrat crew. They
Yeah.
definitely supported Lincoln during the war. So it was this kind of weird political like flip-flop for the war for them.
Does
Obviously because they had an opportunity here, you know?
Right. Is there also like maybe a feeling of like kinship with Lincoln? Because fun fact, folks, I know Illinois is called the land of Lincoln, but Lincoln is not from Illinois. He is from Kentucky. And he made it very clear that his favorite politician was a fellow Kentuckian
Yeah.
whose, oh my gosh, name is escaping me. You'll know it. The famous Whig.
I might not. I might not.
Oh
My Whig
gosh,
politics are not very sharp, but I believe you.
it'll
And
come to me
actually, I did
eventually.
look
But
into that. I did look into that while I was, while I was trying, when I was looking into this. The thing with the Kentucky colony, they were really high class people back in Kentucky.
mm,
Lincoln was not so much. It could be that there was some sort of patronage network going on, but if that was true, I wasn't able to find evidence of it. With the Kentucky colony, they were plantation owners, they owned slaves, they were wealthy. The head family was the Honor family, and their ancestor had actually opened up the Ohio River for trade down to New Orleans. So these people were well in, for a very long time. And the reason they're called the colony up here in
mhm,
Chicago is because when they moved in 1853, they bought a big tract of land just on the outskirts of Chicago and built interlocking plantation estates.
mm,
So all the families, they married into each other. They, got each other elected to prominent positions, stuff. It was a very tight crew, and
yeah,
they were a colony.
right, yeah.
And by the end of the war, they pretty much had a stranglehold on Chicago um, politics and organized crime. So, Bone Lotta could not have been using Pinkerton's network without paying off the colony people. At the very least, he'd have to be paying them off. I mean, what they were as partners, but I'm just saying what the minimum is given the criminal situation in Chicago at that time.
Yeah.
But
The name of the Kentuckian Whig is Henry Clay.
oh, Clay.
Uh,
Oh, yeah.
Henry Clay. I believe Lincoln also said, maybe in his first inaugural address, that his politics align with that of Henry Clay, and he has always considered himself a Whig. So anyway, that's my little bit about
Yeah,
Lincoln and
it's
Kentucky.
the guy was complicated. Let's put it
Yeah.
that way. But other
Yes.
names you'll recognize, the Kentucky Colony, Henry Honor was kind of their banker.
Hmm.
But Harrison's a good Southern name. We had a President
Right.
Harrison.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
that family was a Kentucky colony family. Okay,
Uh,
a lot there's it was they were connected well before they came to Chicago. They were just really crooked too.
yeah. So okay, so Bone Lotta has the approval of the administration straight from the get-go. What's the relationship between the counterfeiting and the prostitution, the
Okay, yeah.
trafficking of freed slaves, republicanism,
Mhm.
universalism, right?
Yeah.
Like they all of these people involved in this, you describe as radical Republicans. They
Yeah.
are, well, I think this is a mixed bag, but they tend to be anti-slavery, at least some of them being abolitionists,
Yeah, they were
right?
more like anti-slave power than anti-slavery. Like
Right.
they didn't like the plantation owners controlling Southern politics. What
Mm.
happened to the slaves was kind of second, you know?
Yeah.
They
Oh,
wanted to break the slave power is
yeah.
what they wanted to do.
Can I go on a tangent here
Yeah, for
because
sure.
I taught U.S. history for a little bit when I was teaching high school.
Okay.
So I made this a very important point to stress
Mhm.
to my students that being anti-slavery and being abolitionist are not the same thing.
No,
And
no, 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 no.
anti-slavery is very much a euphemism for we don't want, as you say, the slave power here. We don't want slavery allowed as an institution. Um, but what that really means is we don't want that because we don't want blacks here. We do not want the commingling person, say
Wow.
the
And
phrase.
also, this goes deep. This goes far back because I talk about this a little bit in the book. But during the 1776 revolution, there were Northerners who really, powerful Northerners like the Livingston family, who were monarchists. They wanted their
That's
own
right.
monarchist state
Yeah.
up there. And the only reason they went against King George is because they thought King George wasn't hard enough against Parliament. They wanted their own sort of aristocratic state or kingdom, I guess you'd call it, up there in the north. And what stopped them was Southern plantation owners. Okay.
Don't the Livingstons, they specifically or explicitly advocated for feudalism too?
Oh,
Or was it,
they
or
were
like,
terrible. They were terrible, yes. And they forced their tenants to work for them for free. Okay? These weren't anti-slavery people.
right. Yeah.
And when the tenants revolted, the Livingstons would have them punished according to slave revolt law, British slave revolt law in the West Indies. Okay? These were not anti-slavery people. But they were pro-power people, okay? They loved
Yeah.
power. And what the Southern slaveholders represented was a voting bloc, in the Continental Congress, in the U.S. government, that opposed that monarchist interest. The Livingstons were a bad crew. I mean, they were into piracy. They were into piracy. They controlled prostitution in New York. How that worked is they would own the tenements that the
Mm.
prostitutes would work out of. So they would tax the
Right.
prostitutes in
You're
that
right.
way. You
Um,
know, um, they would seize farmers' land. They would retroactively change laws that made that legal for them.
yeah.
I mean, these guys were actually the foundation of their power was with treaties that they made with Indian tribes early
Yeah.
on in
Yeah.
the colonial United States' existence. The Indians were a powerful mercenary force. I mean, I like to call them land pirates because they kind of were the Livingston's land pirates next to the Livingston's sea pirates.
Hey, folks, this is not an ad. It is a public service announcement. The MacIver Institute is doing big things for the state of Wisconsin. I mean, heck, Bill and I are putting out research pretty much every day on energy, the budget, Medicaid, you name it. Then there's the great Richard Moore and Dan O'Donnell, who write and create weekly videos for us. And oh yeah, we've even got WISN's Ben Yount, who writes a daily news article on all the biggest Wisconsin stories. Be sure to visit MacIverInstitute.com to stay up to date on everything that's going on. But if you're ever too busy thinking and acting locally, sign up for our weekly newsletter. We'll send the biggest stories straight to your inbox. Sign up at MacIverInstitute.com. Let's get back to the show.
And these Livingston interests would fight with other pirate interests down the United States coast,
Right.
trying to corner trade, trying to steal what they could from the Spanish. Political advocates for the Livingston family. Okay, so the succession is very clear. You
Yeah.
know, as soon as the Livingstons lost their dream of their New Jersey kingdom, they started partnering with abolitionist Quakers. Okay. They still own slaves. I mean, the Livingstons own slaves too, right? But suddenly their conscience got to them.
Uh-huh.
And I feel like with the anti-slavery crowd, that often happens. There's often a personal profit motivation behind the high-flying, the altruistic sounding political prose.
Right.
And I perhaps this is where we're going with the human smuggling too, because
Yeah.
Alan Pinkerton was also famous for his work on the Underground Railroad,
Right.
right?
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you a question about this because you said something that was really fascinating about the Underground Railroad, which after you said it, I was like, of course that would exist.
Mhm.
And what you say is that um, maybe you can give us an idea of like the extent of this. But
Okay.
the Underground Railroad was very much a profit-oriented
Yes.
business. There are opportunists
Mm-hmm.
all along the way whose motivation is not to liberate these poor slaves,
Mm-hmm.
suffering under slavery in the South, but
Mm-hmm.
to remove them and traffic them to the North
North.
for their own
Yeah.
personal gain. Can you tell us
Right, where they
about
can
that?
be cheap, exploitable labor. Okay, well, the Underground Railroad, I mean, we all know the story, right? It's got great
Mhm.
press as being this altruistic organization, you know. The reality of it was that a lot of the traffickers, the people, helping slaves run from one place to another one, or the boat operators shipping slaves to the north, did it for profit. Okay? They got money for doing this. The Underground Railroad was organized. It had what they called investors, like William Seward and his family, who would finance parts of it to make sure the supply chain was maintained. But yeah, no, there were up and down. You had to have money to get, if you were the slave, you had to get money to get yourself up north where you could work for somebody else for a depressed wage, okay? And in fact, Salmon Chase is the perfect example of this moral ambiguity. I'm not even sure that might be a happy face on it. Because in his memoirs, he talks about giving money to other lawyers who played this game. Okay, I've got this slave. The slave has been apprehended. If I send her back south, I'll get $10. If I ship her north, I'll get $5. So, which do I choose to do?
Right.
That's the Underground Railroad. And the Quakers got, they are from the time of the English Civil War, they were very good propagandists.
Hmm.
They really controlled the pamphleteering market, in the English speaking world for many, many, many years. They were very good at promoting themselves as being benevolent, while at the same time making a ton of money.
Yeah.
And that's where we get this sort of fairy tale of the Underground Railroad as being an altruistic institution.
Right.
Yeah.
It really takes away from the claim that, the Civil War, which itself is an inaccurate term just on technical grounds, but it really takes away from the claim that the Civil War was good versus evil.
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
it
No,
it
no.
it's they're both bad. Hey folks, this is not an ad, it is a public service announcement. The MacIver Institute is doing big things for the state of Wisconsin. I mean, heck, Bill and I are putting out research pretty much every day on energy, the budget, Medicaid, you name it. Then there's the great Richard Moore and Dan O'Donnell, who write and create weekly videos for us. And oh yeah, we've even got WISN's Ben Yount, who writes a daily news article on all the biggest Wisconsin stories. Be sure to visit MacIverInstitute.com to stay up to date on everything that's going on. But if you're ever too busy thinking and acting locally, sign up for our weekly newsletter. We'll send the biggest stories straight to your inbox. Sign up at MacIverInstitute.com. Let's get back to the show.
It totally flips on its head the propaganda and the way of thinking about the situation of these people.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the times these traffickers, these underground railway traffickers, were other freed slaves. Okay?
Oh.
And they were taking runaway slaves up to areas like in Chicago, where they would live under the suzerainty of a black organized crime lord. Okay,
Hmm.
so this was not the gateway to a better life that it's often portrayed. And, there were black organized crime organizations in these cities, northern cities, who were very instrumental in helping exploitative northern employers break strikes, depress wages. The northern industrialists were addicted to cheap labor.
Yeah.
And most of the time they were getting this labor from places back in Europe where wars, famines had left huge groups of people extremely desperate. And they'd come over here to work and they'd enter ghettos and maybe they got the vote, yeah, but they had to vote according to ethnic organized crime lords contracts with plutocratic elites. Okay, so it wasn't
Mm.
like you could just come over and enjoy the American dream. At least not in this case in places like Chicago. I mean, you came over and you were a bartering chip in a larger corruption scheme. And that was if you organized, if you tried to organize to get better wages, safer working environments, then they had all sorts of tricks up their sleeve. One of these of which was to import black people from the South
Hmm.
who were very easily exploited. They didn't have connections. It wasn't easy for them to get another job somewhere else. They were
Right.
very poor, maybe not well trained in a trade, and depress wages through that. So you were
Yeah.
between a rock and a hard place if you were a European immigrant working in the North.
Yeah, because there's so much unskilled labor
Hmm.
flooding into the north. That's going to depress wages, like without a doubt.
Exactly.
There's a huge supply of labor. You are imminently replaceable.
Right.
And add into the fact that you can, free
Yeah.
some slave in the South and, you know,
Well,
compound
and
that issue.
yeah, and the horrendous fact is that many abolitionists' experience of slavery was when northern contractors would hire groups of slaves from southern slave owners, bring them up to the north, and have them work on massive infrastructure projects.
Mm,
Where they were often treated as badly as the immigrant Irish labor,
yeah,
and certain, you know, Alan Pinkerton's experience of slavery with his crew was precisely that, slaves being abused by northern contractors.
yeah,
It's the same problem with the, English indentured servitude. Death rates for those among those people were very high because employers had no incentive to
yeah,
treat. I mean, you got your 3 years work out of them, and then they
yep.
were,
You have
not
a
your
fixed
problem.
contract, 3, 5, 7 years, use them,
Yeah.
right? Really
Hmm.
run them into the
I know.
ground.
So it's really in a very nefarious mindset, I think, up north. At least among these employers that, were willing to, break strikes with, imported black labor or, those sort of people, like the meat packer sort of people. They're in
Mhm.
Chicago, in our area, it's the meat packer mentality, and it didn't, it's not a Christian mentality. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah.
It's an exploitative mentality.
Hmm. Um, John C.
Oh,
Calhoun, who's the,
mhm.
the famous, Southern statesman,
Yeah.
he's branded in two ways. First, as being the most, ardent defender of slavery, which he was a defender of slavery. There's no debate there. But something that he says in the very few comments about, why he supports a system of slavery is he says that our curious institution, the domestic
Hmm.
institution of the South, which is a euphemism for slavery, um, removes the conflict between capital and labor. And he's being very specific when he uses those terms. He's referring to the North, this conflict between the capitalists, right, the
Hmm.
capitalist class, and the laboring class. And he believes that the institution of slavery resolves this. Of
Yeah.
course, he doesn't. Of course, he has some moral blinders on, and actually just like real blinders on when it
Hmm.
comes to his own slaves,
Hmm.
their productivity, their intelligence, their industriousness, um, and it ignores, very importantly, well, I had some other point that I was going to make from that.
Well, I
Um,
think I see where you're going. And you could say the same thing about serfdom in Europe too. There is like a social contract, you could call it. I
they
guess, there's
the
incentive.
Genoveses, they for the South, they call it paternalism.
Okay.
So the
Yeah.
South developed this paternal culture around slaveholding where they consider themselves benevolent and kind,
Hmm.
good slaveholders. Oh, here's
Hmm.
the thing that Calhoun ignored. He ignored the number of broken tools, the number of burnt barns, burnt fields, the number of just acts of awesome disobedience that slaves would
Hmm.
engage in.
Hmm.
Um, that totally just obliterates his claim that they eliminated the conflict between capital and labor. More barns were set ablaze in the South than in
Like
the North by
intentionally.
intentionally by
Okay. Yeah.
many orders of magnitude. More sick days were taken. Slaves would claim to, fall ill and not be able to work. They'd run
They
away
got
for
sick
weeks and
days.
months at a
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
So I don't exactly know what Calhoun is thinking here. He's obviously not thinking when he says they solved it. But that's the
Yeah.
Southern
You know,
mentality.
well, yeah, and the Northern mentality was a lot more dollars and cents than that.
Yeah.
But yeah, but and I think if I remember from the where we started with the question, we asked about prostitution and how that played in.
Yeah, that's the next thing. Where does the prostitution come
Okay, well, in Chicago, uh, just after the war until the 1890s, most political corruption was funded through gambling. And you had your local crime bosses. Some of them were ethnically oriented, like Michael McDonald was the Irish guy who really ended
in?
up controlling most of because he
Yeah.
partnered with the Kentucky colony. But there were black crime bosses, there were Jewish ones, there was a lot going on. And prostitution was a secondary line of business, I guess you could
Yeah.
call it. It happened, but it wasn't the main money maker. And it was tended to be controlled by English immigrants, which was kind
Oh,
of surprising to me. Yeah.
yeah.
It was the English mafia. Prostitution then was an English
English mafia
mafia.
is not a term I thought I'd hear. I had no idea
Well,
there's an English
You,
mafia. Okay.
yeah, no, it's true. That's a great point. I mean, it tends to be the Irish or the
Right.
Italians that get mad, but there was an English mafia, totally. The Livingstons, I think, are a prime example of that. And maybe,
Fair point.
because of the Livingstons, their tentacles into prostitution back out east, maybe that's why, English criminals had the inn in Chicago that they did. A lot of them were actually English immigrants too. I don't mean like, England derived, like Pilgrim derived type people from the Northeast.
Right.
No, I mean
Right.
actual English
Yeah, not
immigrants
of English
coming.
ancestry,
Right,
off the
right,
boat from England.
right. Um, during about at the same time that the Columbian exhibition happened, it was 1893. Chicago under the underworld flipped and prostitution became the big money maker
Hmm.
instead of gambling. I think, and it was an ethnic crime swap. Before you had mostly the Irish running the gambling rigs. Then after the 1890s, you get the Italians, and most importantly, Austro-Hungarian organized crime comes in to really boost prostitution as the main moneymaker for the Kentucky colony.
Hmm.
And I think there was a big prostitution boom during the Civil War,
Right.
and that
Yeah.
was awful. Mike McDonald was able to corner gambling because he realized that, look, we got to have a Chinese wall between these two things. The prostitution is so obnoxious to the general public that, if we're going to run our gambling parlors over here, we have to have the two, the prostitution has to be really well covered.
Hmm.
And then the public isn't quite so outraged by the gambling and the money making from that. With the Columbian exhibition, we have huge amounts of travelers coming into Chicago. And the whole exhibition is sort of planned. The city planning is such that attendees can easily get up to the Levee District using the elevated railroad. So I mean, it was
Hmm.
almost, and there were exhibitions promoting, prostitution and selling sex, and so at the same time, there's this huge boom, okay, in prostitution, which then the Kentucky colony uses to consolidate their hold on Chicago, yes, but they also go international. Okay, you get Bertha Palmer,
Ah,
and I don't want to jump ahead of myself too far, but Bertha Palmer was born Bertha Honore. She was Henry Honore's daughter. Okay, so she was kind of the princess of the Kentucky colony. She married Potter Palmer, who was the big State Street developer. Um, he was business partner and sort of the mentor of Marshall Field. You'll probably know from Marshall Field's department store.
right. Yeah.
And then they went on, to spawn all these things like Selfridges out in London and stuff like that. Um, anyway, when she came into power, She was very much sort of riding the wave of prostitution money, corrupting politics back out east. Chicago, the Kentucky colony really came into their own with the Grant administration.
Hmm.
One of Grant's sons married Bertha's sister. So, you have like the sort of preeminent Republican family marrying into the preeminent Democrat family here in Chicago. And it's sort of, and then they go on to specialize in Austro-Hungarian diplomacy, at the same time that Austro-Hungarian organized crime became their big moneymaker in Chicago. Okay, and why was that? Why was that? That's where my first book comes in.
Yeah, right.
Prostitution in Austria-Hungary was a Habsburg-sponsored, a state-sponsored organized crime. Okay? I call them the Galatian Gang. They were human traffickers that lived in the old Arendar lands, the borderlands between the Russian Empire and the Austrian Empire after Maria Theresa, okay? And they were excelled in human trafficking. Most human trafficking for commercial sex was controlled by the Galatian Gang at that time. And they could do this because the Habsburg policy was tolerated prostitution.
Mm.
If you politically cooperated with the Habsburg, meaning if you gave money, if you gave information on political dissidents, if you paid the right people off, if you supported the emperor in rebellious regions like Bohemia that didn't want to be under Habsburg control, if you supported the emperor, or Hungary, they didn't want to be under Habsburg control either. But if you were politically aligned, you could run your prostitution business and use state-sponsored transport systems like the railways, like the shipping ports, to get your thousands and thousands of girls all over the world, and move them around. Because that was a big part of the bordello system. You always wanted fresh goods.
Yeah.
Right? They were
Yeah.
always struggling to recruit enough kids really to get into the system so that they'd have enough, fresh meat on sale all over the world. It was
Yeah.
horrific. They had a very organized, well thought grooming system, for getting disadvantaged kids into this. And of course, under Habsburg law, once you engaged in prostitution, you were kind of in this gray zone. You were a slave, basically. You could be sold to different bordellos. You could be shipped overseas. They often operated under a system of debt slavery. But of course, by this time, there was drugs involved too and things like that. And you became a commodity. And the Kentucky colony, bless their hearts, were very forward in seeing what the situation was in Austria and how they could benefit from that, given that so much of Chicago's population were immigrants from the old Habsburg territories. You see?
Yeah.
And at the same time, there was the socialism problem. Okay, so the cheap immigrant labor that they were addicted to was angry. They were angry at having their wages depressed. They were angry at their living conditions. Socialism appealed to them. And you have a lot of German immigrants who were really the sort of kings of socialism, really, who were very well organized. They were veterans of the 1848 revolutions. They knew how to communicate with people and how to organize. And so the Kentucky colony were dealing with threats to their empire in much the same way that the Kaiser was in Prussia and that the Habsburgs were after 1848 in their holdings. So, of course, what did the Kentucky colony do? They send their favored son, Carter Harrison III, over to German Europe to learn everything there is about socialism, at a time when the Prussian Secret Service was starting to use socialism, use socialist agitator networks to undermine their competitors in Europe. Okay. A lot, I'm sure you've heard about Lenin being, transported through Germany back into Russia and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Prussian Secret Service. They were terrible. They loved to play with fire.
Oh.
Okay. And of course, what does Carter Harrison do when he comes back to the United States? Haymarket riot. he instigates a socialist riot where police officers get killed. Police officers were killed after Carter Harrison's demagoguery, okay? And of course, that sends the rest of the population against socialism, against the immigrant laborers who just want, safer working conditions and reasonable wages,
Hmm.
you know? And that shuts down socialism in Chicago for many, many decades. And the elite plutocrat families, even Republican, Democrat alike, are cheering Carter Harrison, saying, thank you for solving this problem. Well, using ideas that were being employed by the Kaiser, back in Europe. You know, you could make the argument that socialism served the Kaiser, very, very well until it
Yeah.
didn't. He was the guy who was in control in Europe after 1848. And certainly, like Wilhelm Straber, the head of his secret police, Straber claimed that he used these networks as agitators down in Austria, because of course, the Kaiser and the Habsburgs, they were always loggerheads trying to control bigger chunks of Europe.
Yeah.
Counterfeiting has an important tie in there too, because Straber said that socialist agitation in Europe was financed by counterfeiting. Okay. Marx, Engels, they all came from the Rhinish area in Germany, right?
Hmm.
The biggest counterfeiters in Europe all came from that same Rhinish area. And when Straber sort of wound these guys up, he started using those Rhinish counterfeiters to pay his informant network down in Austria. That's what he claims. Okay. So these are the types of games that Prussian spies and Austrian spies and French spies and English spies were getting involved in at this time. It was all, and of course, the Galatian gang, they seemed to always be in the right place to have the information, that you needed on who to buy so you could twist this socialist movement for your purposes there, it
Yeah.
just happens to work out that way.
Oh my gosh. This is such a web of deceit and really ingeniousness. Uh,
Yeah, it's 3D
it's
chess,
it's
right?
hard not to be impressed with the lows that people sink
Mm,
to,
hmm
but just
hmm
really, really clever.
Yeah, they wanted
Um,
power bad.
I have, I guess, one last question.
Okay.
Um, do you have an idea of, say, what proportion of the war effort was financed by counterfeiting notes? Like, we know how much debt the union incurred.
Yeah.
Do we have an
In
idea
order
of
to
like
get a
what in
statistic like that,
monetary inflation was?
in order to get a statistic like that, there would have had to been the political willpower to do a thorough investigation of the counterfeiting network
Mhm.
and how long they were operating and who they were selling money to. There was never political will to do that.
And there'd need to be political will to
There
make
would
them
need to
keep
be.
accurate ledgers as well.
Yes, exactly. I mean, when you're talking about stacks of, $500 bills, $1,000 bills, counterfeiting on an industrial scale. And it's not just normal counterfeiting. It's not just putting it into circulation into the general public. It's giving it to banks who then make loans based on those bills as an asset. So there's a
Right.
force multiplier there.
Hmm.
I mean, even if they want it, a lot. It had a lot of impact. I don't see how it could be anything less than a lot.
Um,
Given the way that they were injecting it into the economy.
right. So how does it go bust? When does
Never did. It never did.
I thought Bone Lotta he gets his an indictment, right?
Right. He gets
And a
stopped.
conviction?
Yeah. Oh, I see
Oh,
what you're saying. Like, when did they have to stop counterfeiting?
yeah, yeah.
September 1871.
September
Yeah.
1870.
Yeah,
Okay, okay.
that's when they had to regroup and focus in on the more traditional things like prostitution and gambling and stuff like
Right.
that. Yeah, so I mean it was very gently wound up. The main counterfeiters got away. Bon Latta did jail time. He was probably the head distributor. So he did do some jail time. But all the other enablers, they just had to take their money and invest it well in other places.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happened. Like for instance, here in Arabot Ludlow built a hotel that he was inspired to build by his friend Potter Palmer down in
Mhm.
Chicago. Okay. And the Palmer House Hotel, I mean, have you heard of this hotel in Chicago?
Yeah. Well, have now since
Oh
I've
yeah,
read your
yeah.
book. So
It was a
I
big
did not
deal
have
back
prior
in its
knowledge
day.
of it though.
Yeah, I mean, it was a big deal back in its day.
Mm,
And as readers of my book will find out, it was the grooming ground for the lords of the levee, the crime bosses who would go down to the bordellos and get their tax for the Kentucky colony.
mm,
So, it was a flagship opulent hotel that would welcome high class prostitutes, would welcome stage and theater people, and it became a must stop destination for people who are living the high life, in Chicago.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, so that's how that's where the money went. I mean,
Yeah.
not just the Palmer, not just the Palmer House Hotel, but that sort of when you can in the book you can see there's a picture of Chicago's red light district, okay, before and after the Columbian exhibition, and you get shanties before, and then by the time 1890 rolls around, these are massive, beautiful stone buildings, you
Yeah.
know. So they
I've
took
got,
that
I don't know
ocean.
if it can be seen, but there's
Yeah,
the,
that's the Palmer House
yeah.
Hotel. Gorgeous building. It's still there. It's still being run as a hotel.
Okay.
Beautiful building, you know. But yeah, I mean, the money went to develop Playtime Chicago,
Mhm.
many entertainments beyond prostitution too, like theaters and the Ziegfeld, the Ziegfeld Empire. Okay. Um, Flo Ziegfeld, the sex show guy in New York, he
Mhm.
got his start working for the Kentucky colony during the Columbian Exposition, when prostitution boomed. His dad was a German immigrant who had some really remarkable connections with German intelligence. Okay. Papa Ziegfeld was able to organize the Kaiser's personal band to come to Boston to celebrate the end of the Civil War in the 70s. It was one of those 70 years. I mean, he had
Yeah.
excellent connections. And of course, when he came to Chicago, then he had excellent connections. And Bertha Palmer would support his music school and attend his soirees and make them newsworthy events. And okay, with Austro-Hungarian prostitution and human trafficking, police in Austria recognized that traveling musical groups were a primary vector, like they were a cover for
Uh,
moving these girls around, right?
yeah.
Flo Ziegfeld's dad could organize almost 300 of these troops on a dime for the Columbian exhibition. Okay. So he had friends in all the right places, which so often seems to happen with the intelligence community and organized crime.
All right.
Okay. So that's where Flo Ziegfeld, the New York phenomenon, comes from. He was actually a Chicago phenomenon before. So yeah, the money went in there. There were other kind of interesting things that went on. For instance, when the British lost control of prostitution in Chicago, the Kentucky colony brought up sisters, the Everly sisters from Nebraska, to run the flagship bordello in Chicago. It was called the Everly Club. Prior to that, it had been managed by this Englishman named Christopher Columbus Crabbe. And they call him the inheritor of fortunes because his madams would always die and leave all their money to him. He's probably the real A.H. Holmes. Okay.
Oh, okay.
That's probably, there's all sorts of weirdness over Holmes and that, but at about the time Christopher Columbus Crabbe lost power, the Holmes story sort of appeared in the press. Okay. And this is, the Columbian Exposition time. Anyway, these Nebraskan sisters who are business partners with the Bryant family, as in William Jennings Bryant.
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
his cousin was his political scientist cousin was one of the Kentucky colony families, you know.
Okay.
So his girlfriends come up from Nebraska and start running the Everly Club. And they specialize in entertaining foreign guests, like the the um, the Prince of Prussia when he came, and they would put on these, very bizarre sex shows.
Hmm.
And the story about what the prince did during these sex shows would, spread around. It starts to smell very much like a compromat factory.
Like a what
Like
factory?
a compromat factory. Like you invite foreign dignitaries over, you get information on them behaving in an inappropriate way, and then you
Got
can
it.
kind of
Yeah.
hold that over them.
Yeah. Yeah. So they're farming blackmail.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
You know? And yeah, and a lot of times these weird sex shows had very strange occult overtones to them. Like, do you remember the Paris Olympics where they had that kind of strange dude dressed like all blue when he came out on the
Oh,
train?
yeah.
And they said it was a parody of the Feast of Dionysus.
Hmm.
Well, that's exactly what they put on. That's exactly what the Everly Club put on for the Crown Prince of Prussia.
No way.
Yes, exactly. They
What?
had prostitutes coming out, tearing at raw meat, with
What
their
in the
mouths.
world?
They had like a god, a raw meat god,
Yeah.
Dionysus wheeled in,
Wow.
and they had somebody in the background that would bellow, as the prostitutes bit into the side of the god, and then everybody went and had sex. And this thing, have you heard of like drinking champagne from a woman's shoe? Have you heard of that
No.
trope? Okay, maybe
Mm-mm.
it's too old, but that is a trope, and it's like
Hmm.
supposed to be an example of extreme hedonism.
Okay.
That's from that night. So what ended up happening was the Kentucky colony entertained this prince as he came, got him really drunk, had him participate in an occult orgy, and then wrote about it in newspapers. And as you can imagine, the Kaiser wasn't very happy to hear about that. Okay, and that's the one we know about. All
Yeah.
right.
So how many
Mhm,
other such
mhm.
events?
Now apparently Bertha Palmer was in charge of entertaining the prince, or her boy, her brother and son were in charge of entertaining the prince during this visit. Hmm. Bertha Palmer ends up going to England and putting on sex shows for Prince Albert, who will become Edward VII. Okay. She ends up facilitating his affairs. She's in all the right places to get compromise. Okay. And she seems to be doing this alongside a gentleman called Ernst Cassel, who was a prominent banker in the UK at that time. So it's fishy smelling stuff that's going
Yeah,
on in
definitely.
Chicago. And like with the Epstein things that are coming out now, it's kind of like not last generations, but maybe 4 generations ago.
Yeah, so
You know what
there's
I'm saying?
some rhyming going on here. Andrea, this has been incredible. Thank you so much for coming on. The book is Lincoln's Counterfeiters, the Wisconsin gang that funded the Union and started the Chicago mob. I got this on Amazon. Where else can people get this?
Okay, if you're in Madison, you can get it at Leopold's Bookstore, which is downtown Madison. You can also get it in Verona's at the Garden Wall Bookshop. Okay, so those are two independent retailers. I really recommend them. It is available on Amazon and the big online retailers also. I think pretty much every one of them will have it.
Sweet.
Um, and also I will be at Leopold's on the 21st, October 21st, which is Tuesday. It's going to be 6 p.m. So I'll be there signing books, talking about it. And they're even making Kentucky Colony cocktails for me. So if
Oh,
you're interested in that, yeah, if you want to have a taste of what the Kentucky Colony drank, you can have it at Leopold's on the 21st of October.
awesome. And how do people keep in touch with what you're doing? You have a
Okay.
website, social media, stuff like that?
My main channel is my website. It's AndreaNolan.com, and that's Andrea Nolan, Nolen.com. And I have all my author events and that sort of stuff, and some original writing up there too. So, yeah, that's the best way.
All right. Well, thanks very much for joining me. You are the second guest on the Unregulated podcast.
Oh, that's cool.
So
Thank you. Well, thanks for
um,
having me, Michael. It's been awesome.
you're very welcome, and thank you.